So anyway, we're going to start trying to collect some questions from you on this session. And I've got a couple here in my hand already. And I will start dispensing these questions. This is for Brad. Brad, you still with us? There you go. Beaver are an integral part of riparian health. Well, they are in some places. Beaver are an integral part of riparian health. How do beaver colonies affect stream storage? And what effect might beaver activity have on years of drought?
Beaver can build dams, slow water, collect sediment, build floodplains, build up the soil so that you can store more water longer into the growing season. And that can be very beneficial. Sometimes I think if you got beavers building into the sides of stream banks instead of building dams, sometimes water can start flowing through those channels, and in certain conditions probably lead to bank erosion. Like anything, they can be good, bad, or ugly. It depends on the context of the situation. And that situation, as Barry just showed, changes over time. I'm not sure I got all the points of that question, but.
Most of it. And a lot of times we forget that there is this thing called bank beaver. They don't build dams. They just drill holes into the bank in your rivers, and that's how they function. So they're not, they have been pretty doggone successful in some areas. But in other areas, it's probably not as efficient of an approach.
Well, and I think a lot of it, what types of flow events are we going through? If you got a series of dams going miles up a fairly steep channel, and you get events like we had in 1984, and this probably happened up in the Built Creeks on Built Creek, when that first one blows out and it starts hitting all those below it, you get a much greater increase of water because of not only do you have the flow, but you have what was held behind each of those dams. And if it builds a debris dam farther down and you get pooling from that, and then that one breaches. There's all kinds of different scenarios.
And the gradient plays a big role too. I mean, there's some beavers know when they can build something and it'll stay. And so stream gradient plays a big role in their success as well. This one's for Paul. What are the steps of recovery for streams that are incised? Years of sediment, silt deposition to raise the stream bottom? Question mark. How active should we be in accelerating the timeline of recovery through the use of willow wattles and gabion rock dams and their ilk?
Okay, thanks. Right before I do that, I'll just add one little thought to the beaver response. I think Brad and Barry hit some pretty important thoughts in the really high flow years, what can happen, but in lower flow years, a series of beaver dams in the right channels can dramatically increase the amount of storage in that big sponge that's in that beaver dam and pond network. So like Brad said, it can be all over the board. Okay, to address the recovery period, I'm going to share my screen real quick here and get the right one. So a lot of, I go ahead and do slideshow here. So you should be seeing a slide, a couple of series of different stream types. Is that what you're seeing, Barry?
Yes.
Okay, so these are some situations that are very common throughout the West, including in Nevada. The top one is where an E channel, this is the really narrow, deep channel with a whole lot of meanders, develops inside of an incised channel. So, a former gully, the gully is over here with the G, really deep, narrow thing. So the steps that it goes through, this series assumes that you started up here on the surface with an E channel, and then it changed, it got less sinuous, a little bit steeper, and then it just incised down into this gully. And so starting here, this is very common. That gully needs to widen out, and that happens through erosion. A lot of folks that are conducting PFC assessments call that good erosion, because you need to widen that narrow gully out to where those inside floodplains start developing again, and then eventually back to that E channel, just that it's down in an old incised gully instead of up on the surface of the valley. There's a similar series down here, assuming that the C channel is the potential for that area. And these are both from Rosgan's work. And these are used pretty heavily in PFC assessments. And so they make a point in the PFC books that, this original E channel and original C channel would be functioning properly, but so would these E and C channels that develop inside an old incised gully. Part of the question was what to do to accelerate it. There's quite a move lately to let the water do the work as much as possible. That's kind of a popular catchphrase. But I'll point out that some folks have used mechanical means or high concentrations of livestock to accelerate the widening of a really narrow, deep gully into this wider gully to where the inset floodplains can start developing. And so it seems like the place to accelerate recovery would be in here. You could divert water to really accelerate the erosion to get the that channel to widen out so it could develop its own floodplains, or something else. That's a great question. And last thing I'll say here is, you notice the diagram that Barry put up showed more of a cyclic dynamic. Other folks tend to stick to a linear approach, and I'll just leave it at that.
We don't want to get too carried away today. We just want little bites, right? Not too much. Okay, next question. And I'll let either one of you or both of you answer this one. Generations ago, it was believed that spraying, destroying trees in riparian zones would increase surface flows due to less water uptake by trees. Besides issues of bank and stream stability and water quality, how much does tree or willow canopy shade affect water loss due to evaporation?
Well, I'll take a shot at it, Brad, unless you're ready to go.
No, you can go first.
So I've heard quite a bit about the amount of water that folks believed was taken up by woody riparian plants. Not as much about the shading, how the shading or lack of shade affected the evaporation. But I think it's really hard to separate out kind of the water yield question from the bank stability part, because I have a pretty good idea that in some of those instances where the trees and shrubs were sprayed out, resulting in an increased amount of water flow, it was turning loose some of the water that was held in a more effective riparian sponge with those woody plants being present. So it's kind of all tied together. I'd have a hard time separating out, just one piece of that. And I think the kind of the general consensus now is that we're probably better off, assuming that the streams need those woody stabilizers in them, we're probably better off with them there than spraying them out.
And I guess I'm not sure how to answer it, but you need something. How much? And how much of anything becomes too much? Because of anything that's good, you can also have too much of it. Not enough or too much. And what's that fine line? And that's going to vary by where you are in the landscape, the stream type, the valley bottom, the alluvial fan, what's the normal flow on that site. There's a lot of factors that go into it. But I think it's worth recognizing you can always have too much of a good thing too.
Well, that brings you back to this concept of outcome-based management. What do you want in the future? And you manage that process of willow encroachment. If you want a lot of willows out there in the future, okay. But if that's something that you don't want, then you have to manage that process. And so, depending on what the outcomes are, what the agreed upon outcomes are, maybe it's too much, maybe it's not, right?
In a highly variable environment like Nevada, you're always managing multiple risks.
Yeah. Well, here's sort of a similar question. Where does willow and woody species fit in the cycle, and are they necessary?
So are they necessary part of the question, at least in the PFC approach, is handled by determining the potential of the site. So for example, a lot of those narrow, deep streams that have a lot of room to spread out over floodplains, usually those don't need the woody plants to stabilize them. Some of the other stream types tend to need both woody and non-woodies to reach the level of stability that the folks are looking for with those PFC assessments.
Okay. The last question that I have right now is, managing to the future takes a lot of in-depth land management history. Honest history is important. Yes or no?
Yes, I think that's a pretty easy yes. I mean, we need to think about, and that should be pretty inclusive. We need to, as Barry was hitting on, and Brad mentioned too, we need to be pretty comprehensive in our best understanding of what got us to where we are today, in order to move forward. And we the global we have a pretty strong track record of focusing in on a couple of land uses. I'll leave it at that. And so a complete history is very helpful.
History is important. You can't connect all the dots well without it.
Yes. I think I have another question on its way, but in the meantime, what I'm going to do is close this session out, and we'll have Robert queue up what Paul has to say. Now, Paul is going to give us an update on his virtual fence project that he's established and is establishing up in Northeast Nevada. So, Robert, if we could cue that up.
Barry, I think I'm sharing.
Are you just going to talk it through? Or are you going to cue it up?
I'm going to cue it up. Here we go.
Okay. No problem.
Okay.
I'll step aside.
Switching gears from PFC to virtual fencing. Originally, I wasn't planning to talk about virtual fencing again at Cattlemen's Update. I was afraid I'm developing a reputation of virtual fence guy. So, but last year I was talking about, in a general sense, what we might see as uses for virtual fencing for rangeland livestock production in Nevada. And this year I can say we did get a project started, and here's an update on what we've been up to. But to that first point, I want to make it clear that at least my opinion is that that second bullet in the green text is a better representation of what I think. I think it might have some promise. I think it might be part of the answer, but it's not necessarily the answer. And what I'm getting at here is, we have a great toolbox, a lot of tools to manage animal distribution on rangelands. Everything from water, a variety of supplements. We have conventional fencing of various kinds. And then we have that very, very important interaction between humans and livestock in forms of stockmanship and herding. And so I don't want to ever be pigeonholed into thinking that we're going to replace these, but rather I'm interested in seeing if this virtual fencing tool might be a good one to add to the toolbox. And one of the reasons I'm most interested in this is that, time and time again, a lot of our natural resource challenges that relate to livestock grazing management on rangelands deal with animal distribution. And that is where I think if it fits our systems and our production systems, that's where an additional tool might be real handy. So I think virtual fencing might show some promise in helping us manage animal distribution. So what we've done, we've developed a great mix of partners. The list here includes folks that are providing funding for this study one way or another, whether that's cash or in kind. I'm starting out with the 2 ranches that have agreed to work with us. Those are the Cottonwood Ranch and Maggie Creek Ranch. These folks have real costs involved. We're using their animals, their employees, their time, on and on and on. So that is very much appreciated. We couldn't do this without the contributions from these ranches. The virtual fence company we're working with is called Vince. We are buying the systems from Vince, but I know for a fact that they are giving us a deal. We've got some reduced prices that we're paying. And so even without those folks are contributing an awful lot in kind. We have cash contributions from the Bureau of Land Management and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The Fish and Wildlife Service, that comes through their Partners for Fish and Wildlife. So both BLM and the Partners Program, thank you very much for the funding provided. We've got an experiment station proposal or grant that is funding a good portion of this project as well. And our grad student, a master's student, Nathan Burro, he's underpaid, so I figure he's contributing some in-kind contributions as well. Now, BLM, Forest Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, all the agencies have been very excited about this, very supportive in concept and really interested in what's going on. I left a gap there and said the future, maybe the Forest Service, that is with respect to funding. If we're getting short, we might come knocking on the Forest Service door to see if we can have them throw some money in the pot as well. Special shout out to Catherine Dyer. This was a new deal. BLM system-wide wasn't really sure how to authorize this system on BLM lands. And she did some legwork with the Washington office and helped us figure out how to get the permission to put a virtual fence system on public lands. So a lot of great partners and really appreciate all types of support. So our overall goal, we are really interested in scaling up, looking at closer to ranch scale applications of virtual fencing on rangelands in Nevada. And this is because so much of the work I'll say all the work I talked about last year, the early work on virtual fencing, the research anyway, was small groups of animals, like 6, 7, up to maybe 20 animals, 30 at the tops, and land areas on the order of square meters, maybe up to 20 acres. And so we wanted to really scale that up and work with hundreds of animals and thousands of acres ultimately. And so we're in the process of figuring out what that looks like. And in general, we're really interested in what the opportunities for usable science. And usable science is an approach to research that involves the end users, the ranchers, of course, the virtual fence company representatives, the agencies involved, to help us come up with the objectives and have those folks be involved all the way through the project. So that's kind of the big picture, what we're shooting for. A quick overview of virtual fence systems and what they do. I'll start down here with the collars on cattle. So these are GPS enabled collars. So they they take a location and they track the animal's location, and they also administer cues to the animal about where they're supposed to be. And those cues are both audio, so a beep, and electrical stimulation. So track the location and then deliver those cues, and also provide a little information about how the system is operating. And then another part of the system, I'll jump up here to the biggest picture, is some kind of computer interface. And this can be on a computer, a smartphone, a tablet. This allows the user to establish virtual fence lines, and that's what this broad red line with a little white line represents. So these aren't post and wire fences, but these are just virtual boundaries out there. And the white is an audio only zone, and the red is a zone, if the animal goes in there, they receive both an audio cue and an electrical stimulation cue. And so what we're showing down here is another feature of the system. This is the track of one animal in that virtual paddock. And these upside down teardrops or location fixes by the GPS collar. You can see that the animal wandered over here to the left side, went into the management zone, got an electrical stimulation cue, quickly went back out, and then came in and checked. So these little speaker symbols indicate audio only with no electrical stimulation. Then back in and then came out. Yep, boundary's still there. I hear a beep. Go back in, wander around, come check. Yep, there's the boundary. Got another beep. Go to the other side. Oh, there's a beep. And then, so this shows that they're pretty well staying in the boundary that the user established for those animals. So you've got the computer system, you've got the collars on the cattle, and then the other component is a tower or a gateway or a base station, depending on what system you're using. Vince calls them gateways, and that's shown over here on the right side. So you need a way to get the instructions about the boundaries and when they are supposed to be enforced to the collars. That goes through the gateway to the collar. And then you get information about the animal's location and the operation of the system. The cues delivered needs to go back through the gateway to the computer interface. So that's a quick overview of the virtual fence system with an emphasis on the Vince system. Okay, so what we've done so far, we've launched the system at both ranches. At Cottonwood Ranch, as of this winter, we have 4 of the 5 gateways that are needed to cover that entire ranch. We have those installed. 3 of those gateways are on BLM, and the other 2 are on Forest Service, and we have 1 of those 2 Forest Service gateways out, and need to put the other one out next summer. We collared about 135 head of cattle in early July, and those collars stayed on through some point in November. I can't remember the exact date, but most of our work was July and August into September, just a little bit with this group. This group of cattle was just under half mature cows, just over half yearling heifers, and I think 4 bulls that we collared. At Maggie Creek Ranch, we put 2 gateways out. Both of those are on deeded land, and we collared similar sized group of animals early July to early September. I think it's actually 133 animals were yearling heifers at Maggie Creek. And so what we did is we dealt with a whole, that's not a big truck, but it's still a truckload of collars. That's the about 135, 140 of the virtual fence collars that we put out at one of the ranches. We started off with a training period at both ranches. I'm just going to show you images and some figures from one of the ranches. The way that the training period went is we had a kind of a narrow management zone, and this is both audio cue and electric stimulation, and that's placed right over an existing conventional fence. And the reason for that is when animals learn the system, we want to make sure that they learn after they get the cues to turn around and not bolt forward. And so we want them to get used to turning around in response to the virtual boundaries as opposed to bolting through. So it starts pretty narrow right on top of the conventional fence. The next step is to widen it out a little bit, try to keep them further off the fence. And then the final stage of the training, add the audio only, that kind of thin white line, before they get into the zone that administers the electrical stimulation. So here's how it looked. These are two different animals on day one of the training. You can see what's happening here, similar tracks. They come in, they get in the management zone, they get the cues, and they come back out. So go back, try it out again, get some cues, and come back out. The one on the right got more of the cues than the one on the left. There are animals with different sensitivities to the cues. And so that may be what we're seeing there. So a little bit more on the training. It was great. Almost all of the animals at this site, 92% of them, interacted with the system and received at least one electrical stimulation cue on the first day of training. And 8% seemed to avoid it. And that was just on day one. So I'll jump to day 3, and this is what we'd hoped for, and we did see a lot of this. I'll give you some numbers to go with this, but again, this is just 2 of the 133 animals shown on day 3, basically coming into the audio only zone. There's a little speaker symbol. They got a beep, turned around, went and looked somewhere else, got a beep, and left. Okay, and then the other one over here looks like they checked it 5 or 6 times and responded just to the audio cue and were able to avoid the electrical stimulation on the 3rd day, the day 3 of training. At first, this animal track over here might startle you. It looks bad, but it's not as bad as it looks, I assure you. This is a sign that collar that animal was wearing was not working right. And by the 3rd day, we had 9 collars that were flipped inside out. And so the contacts weren't against the neck of the animal, and so they basically weren't getting those cues. All those little lightning bolts are electrical stimulation cues, but this animal's collar was inside out, and so it wasn't receiving the cues. So we had 9 that flipped inside out. We had 1 collar fall off. Those things aside, 93% of the heifers avoided electrical stimulation on day 3 and responded to audio cues alone. So this is pretty good evidence that it's working. So that 93% figure, that's if I exclude the 10 collars, the 9 that were inverted, 1 that fell off. It's fair enough to look at that and say, yeah, you shouldn't exclude those. That's part of the system. And if you like to look at it that way, that would take it down to about 86%. If we include those problem collars. Later on at Maggie Creek, we had a lot of problems. So I'll show you over here on the pictures first. Here's our management zone. We've got the beep and electrical stimulation in red, and then the white is audio only. And then these little blotches of different colors. The warmer the color gets, the higher the frequency of animal locations. And so you can just see, just based on what I've said, we had a lot of locations on the wrong side of that boundary. We were trying to keep them in the south half. A little bit later on, we tried to keep them out of a vast majority of the stream through that pasture and just give them access to a little bit of it. And same thing by looking at those color blotches, they were all over in there. I think what happened is we had a high percentage of the animals in this group that were unmanaged because the collars weren't fitting well. And it was actually over 28% of those animals that were unmanaged. And just a reminder, these were yearlings, and that's why I put teenagers in there. So when they decided to do something, they went big, they were enthusiastic, and they ran through fast and very animated. So we just, it shows the importance of having as many of the animals in the group managed effectively as possible. So we were warned. So we had a lot of collars falling off. I mentioned the one that were inverted, and we think there were actually some that just didn't fit well. And our partner at Vince, he warned us. He said, well, these animals are kind of on the small end of what our collars, our version 1 collars, were working on. So the picture here on the bottom right is a version 2 collar. And so we're hoping to use these next year. These should work a lot better, maintain much better contact with the animal, not be as prone to flip over and fall off and provide some of the problems that we had there. So at Cottonwood, we had some more promising results. Again, we had a mixed group of cattle that were collared. So same type of deal. We've got the heat map, they call it, these color blotches. The warmer the color, the more frequent the locations. We took a pasture and subdivided it into 5 units and tried to move through. So here's actually our first subset of that pasture. And you can see we held them in there pretty well. Did have some locations outside. We did have some fit issues at Cottonwood as well, but not near as many. But the vast majority of the locations right where we wanted them to be. After about a week, we're going to move them into the next chunk, which is directly to the north, right above, and that's shown in the right picture. Our plan was to go out and move those animals, or have the cowboys and cowgirls from Cottonwood Ranch go out and move them horseback. And what we found was, within about 30 minutes of changing the boundary, the cattle started moving by themselves, and within an hour, they were all in the second subunit that we had planned to start that day. And so they didn't have to go out and move them at all. So that was really pretty neat. This is a shot in the first subunit where they were right after they left. And so these folks definitely hit their target. They actually had some to go back to for this site. And this is in one of the favorite subsets of that first little virtual paddock that we tried. Continued to have pretty decent luck. I put this in to show the red here right in the audio zone, show that these animals were really constantly checking to see where that boundary is. And that kind of helps us explain how and why they moved on their own when we moved the boundaries. And so, you know, they're spending time in there where we wanted them to be, and they kept checking the boundary to say, hey, humans, do you want us to stay here longer? Again, we did have some animals with collars that weren't working, and that explains some of these other blotches. But all in all, it was more promising. We got ambitious. We tried to do some virtual herding towards the end of the trial, and the left picture here shows we're going to have a moving boundary to push animals to the west end of this pasture and end up in that kind of transparent white and pinkish colored area of the pasture. It started out going pretty well, but then about halfway through they said, we're not doing it, and we never really did get them in to where we wanted them. So this is one where I'm sure if we were moving the animals with cowboys and cowgirls horseback, it would have been no problem. But we tried to do it all with the virtual fence, and that didn't work too well. So more promising, but definitely not perfect. Real quick, just a couple of slides with graphs. Nathan Giroux, the grad student, is working on starting to crunch these data with some help from Mozart. Appreciate that help, Dr. Mozart, for sure. And the shout out you gave us yesterday in your talk. So I put this in for a couple of reasons. One is this is showing us that of all the callers out there, how many electrical stimulation cues were there per day on average? And this is just one of the ranches. And so the vast majority of those callers are getting 5 or fewer electrical stimulation cues per day. And these are artificially high because it includes all of the data from those callers that were flipped over and issued a lot of electrical stimulation cues before they were shut off. But even with that, you know, that there's not much. The animals are doing pretty well avoiding that and responding to the audio cues. The other thing is these different lines are different subunits of the pasture. We started out, we wanted to look at the effects of stock density on the operation of the system. And so these do have different stock densities, but there are also different characteristics among those different pastures or subunits. And so we can't say at this point whether it's stock density or different characteristics of those paddocks. this is how many cues are delivered once an animal goes into that red zone, that management zone. And so same thing, once they go in there, they're not staying very long. There's 1, 2, maybe 3 electrical stimulation cues, and then they're out of there. We have these odd peaks at 4, 7, 11, and then a couple on down the graph, and we think these are related to the way the system works and the way the messages are delivered. But Nathan is working on that. Again, these are artificially high for the same reasons I mentioned before. Nathan started looking at stock density and the number of electrical stimulation cues that are delivered. You can see we're on the high end of stock density here. These are on some pretty productive areas where we were holding animals pretty tight. These top 2 points are both from Maggie Creek, where we had a lot more problems, and so we think those are kind of misleading. Maybe a weak increase in the number of electrical cues per day per collar as stock densities increased, but it's pretty preliminary at this point. Anyway, we're hoping for version 2 collars next year at both ranches. I've put bullets down here to give you an idea of some of the things that we've talked about looking at. I'll let you read through those and jump down to the terrain challenges almost at the bottom there. This picture gives you an idea of the coverage that we're expecting from the 5 gateways that will be out at Cottonwood Ranch. The blue and green areas are where we get really good coverage, and then where you don't see the blue and green, those areas have no coverage or a lot less coverage. And so that's part of what I'm getting at with our terrain challenge, and it'll be an interesting thing for us to work with. And Vince said we are their most challenging, they call them use cases. We're their most challenging use case because of the terrain we're working in. But it's an important question to ask, see if this fits our landscapes. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing there. I didn't pay attention to the time. I hope we didn't go too long.
I think we're good. I've got a few questions that have come in. Does the gateway have a solar panel on it?
It does. Yep. Big solar panel, 2 batteries inside, so the solar charges the batteries, and the batteries carry it through the rest of the time.
How many collars were lost due to, fighting, greasewood, scratching? You mentioned it a little bit, but could you review it?
So yeah, those numbers I mentioned were early on and just at Maggie Creek. And I didn't go back and get the numbers from Cottonwood. So at Maggie Creek, we were down in the sub-irrigated areas where, they did have some shrubs and trees and stuff to rub on, but not near as much as what they had at Cottonwood. I'm just going to throw a wild guess for Cottonwood that we may have had, by the end of the deal, we may have had 15 or 20 collars off. That is a guess, though. I need to get back with Mackenzie and Jason and get those numbers.
Cool. Next question. When a collar isn't working, does it notify you somehow in real time so that you can go fix it? Or do you just keep track by looking at the GPS locations at regular intervals?
Yeah, it does send a message to the system when there are problems. So there are a variety of problem messages that are sent to the system that you can kind of track on that computer interface. Yeah.
So they have a mortality signal on them. So if something dies or if the collar just falls off on the ground, you can go back out and sort of find it.
Yeah. So you'll see one of those little red dots that were on the heat maps. Those are collars that had fallen off. They're very specific. They're little pinpoints, and they keep logging a location in the exact same place. And you can look at that and say, oh, I got a collar off right there. And it does help find them too. Now, as far as a mortality feature, I'm not sure specifically what Vince has right now. They do have accelerometers in these, and they're working on algorithms that give them some information about animal behavior and animal movements. But they're not sharing those yet because they're still developing the algorithms.
What is the lifespan of the collars?
So they figure like a 10-year lifespan on the system. Now the collars specifically would be a little bit shorter. Battery life is a big issue in these collars, and so the version 1 collars, those were expected to last, a few months to a little over a year, depending on how much time the animals spend close to a boundary. And those version 1 collars had batteries that would have to be replaced by taking the collar off, taking the collar apart, and replacing the batteries. Now the version 2 collars have about twice the battery life, I'm told, and then have replaceable batteries so that they can be taken out and replaced without taking the collar off. So that's kind of the best idea I can give you on collar life. I think once you have this new version 2 with the replaceable batteries, we'll get a much better idea what the actual collar life is. But the collars are, aside from batteries, the collars are pretty darn tough.
Have you tested the shock on you and your grad student yet?
No. I haven't even come that close. I've thought about it, but I haven't thought about it very hard. But our Vince partner, he said that some of the folks in the company have tested it, and they compared it to, those joke hand buzzers that I think when Barry and I were kids, we had them. They kind of compared it to that, but no, I haven't tried it on myself yet.
I think there's some hard-headed ones out there that just might take a little bit more than one of those.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, one of the reasons I haven't checked it is I know I am very sensitive to electricity. So I think it'd be more than that little hand buzzer on me.
Yeah. Next question, do you think the future will be an implant of the animal? Do you think this would solve some of the collar problems?
I don't know. I'm not enough of a techie to even make a guess at that one. Yeah, I don't know.
We have some ear tags that might even be able to do it, I suppose. I don't know, but
yeah.
On that one.
And interestingly, some of the early work on this was with ear tags. I think in the early 90s, and the Forest Service was involved in that. They were big ear tags. Those things were like the size of a pop can hanging off a cow's ear. But yeah, they started looking at that.
Another question: Did the operator interface with the computer system? And if so, did you find it usable? In other words, I guess how complex is it for a user? How user friendly is it? The interface?
I'd say it's pretty user friendly. So we had folks from both ranches jump into it and start working with it pretty much right away. And I didn't hear too much. Too many problems that they ran into, and again, I'm not a real techie person. I was actually calling some of our ranch partners and asking them, how did you do this and how did you do that? So I think my impression was it's fairly usable, and it's going to get better. There were some quirky things about it, but it was pretty usable.
Cool. We have any more questions that have come over? Are we exhausted that? We got one more coming.
Okay.
So we'll get that, and then we'll talk about some wild horses and burros very briefly. Thank you, ma'am. All right. Do Do you think we'll look at the eShepherd product also and see if it is similar or more or less useful? I know they have a slightly different design. So you're familiar with the eShepherd product?
Yeah, less so than Vince. And so basically, you know, I kind of reached out to 4 companies that seem to be farthest along in the development of these things. And I got the most response from Vince and eShepherd, who's partnered up with Gallagher now. It was Agerson's. They were moving into the U.S. but weren't quite ready to move. I think it would be worth looking at it, and I'd be darn sure open to looking at it once that's available. Couple of differences: the eShepherd had incorporated some solar panels onto their collars, and so they were dealing with the battery life issue that way. And then there's a little different price structure and how they operate between Vince and eShepherd, and the base stations, as eShepherd calls them, are a little cheaper than the gateways at Vince, but the collars are a little more. So, but yeah, I'd be really interested in seeing how the different systems compare.
Very good. Okay. I am scheduled to give you a very brief update, and I assure you it will be very brief. Update on wild horses and burros and what's going on, at least sort of at a national scale. As many of you may know, some of you may not know, I am a member of the National Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board for Interior and the Bureau of Land Management. I'm also second vice president for the International Society for Range Management, and I'm also on the steering committee for the Free Roaming Equid and Ecosystem Sustainability Network, and a couple of other things. So I have like 3 or 4 or 5 different hats. So I'm going to try and tell you when I'm taking my hat off so that I'm not speaking for somebody that I'm not supposed to be speaking for. So let's start off with the National Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board. It is in a state of flux, as is Interior right now. I can assure you of that. We are supposed to have the name of 2 new members, which would include a chairman, a new chairman, sometime in the next few months, shortly. Those are the words that I have been given. So sometime soon, whenever that may be, and then once we get into a new administration, they may have a different idea altogether. So we're not really sure when that's going to come about, but they're working on getting all of the positions refilled. The division chief, a new division chief was hired that lasted about 1 or 2 days, and they had to go back to the drawing board. And so I have not been informed from BLM about whether or not that position has been filled. If it has been, I haven't been informed, and it's not their duty to inform me first anyway. But that's the last thing that I know about that. So the advisory board, we think, has been fairly effective recently in having BLM reassess some things and change some things. And of course, the move that much of Interior made with BLM to Grand Junction, Colorado, the fallout from that, we're still sort of suffering that. A lot of people didn't move that were going to move, or at least said they were going to move, and at the last minute they didn't. And so there was a number of empty positions in the horse division and other divisions as well within BLM. And so it's just all in a state of flux right now. And of course, there's a new transition team in Washington, D.C. They've named an Interior Secretary, but whether or not she would actually, I mean, she's likely to be approved by the Senate. but these things are pretty fluid, and you just never know what's going to happen until it actually comes down. So it will take a little while for those policies to filter through from the White House to the new Secretary of Interior, and then on down to BLM. So we will see where that goes. Funding wise for BLM, I know that appropriations have already been argued and set, and the last I heard that we're going to get some more money for wild horse and burro management in one form or another. And so I can always encourage you. Let me take off my advisory board hat now and put on a couple of other hats. Senator Cortez Masto from Nevada has been very, very influential in getting some movement in Congress on funding wild horse and burro management issues. And so, you know, an attaboy, a thank you, anything you could do to her office to encourage her to continue doing what she's been doing with respect to wild horses and burros would definitely be something that would be very useful and appropriate. We have some other congressional representatives in the state of Nevada, mostly down in the South, that have opposite views. And so any kind of contact that you might be able to make with them would also be useful as well, I believe. I think we just finished back in, I think it was in November, we had a gathering in Nevada, another one in Nevada over at Fish Creek. They got some more horses off. And so that process of gathering horses has been ramped up but due in large part to increases in funding. That's about, I think, where I want to leave that. The free roaming equid and ecosystem sustainability network had a very large meeting in October in Cody, Wyoming. We have somewhere around between 90 and 100 groups, between sportsmen's groups and advocacy groups and all kinds of groups that are involved in that entity, and it is becoming fairly influential. It's sort of this thing is becoming kind of a multi-headed monster on the hill. We've got this free roaming equid group. We've got the Path Forward up there as well, and so things are looking pretty good and have been looking pretty good in the wild horse and burro management end of things over the last couple of years. Now, what the next administration is going to bring with them, no one knows just as of yet. So we'll just have to pay attention to that and see where it goes. So, unless you have any questions, specific questions with respect to that, that's about all I can tell you at this point in time. So we'll check the Q&A thing here to see if any questions come up. In the meantime, I think our final task today is to finish our evaluation. So Robert, if you are prepared, we could go ahead and throw the poll up and ask you to please fill out the poll. Remember, there's 3 questions on this one, and you'll need to do all 3. So be sure you scroll down and get that 3rd question. Paul, you popped back up. Is there something you would like to advise us of additionally?
Yeah, well, I was thinking more about the question about willows and are they needed and other woody plants. So going back to the PFC stuff, you know, this is something that I've heard from folks here and other places in the West about, you know, that kind of make me think it's easy for some to distinguish between streams that need the woody ones and streams that don't. And I dove into this at one point, and I started looking for data on like root strength and comparing the non-woodies to the woodies. And I need to get back into that because I remember seeing some of these non-woody stabilizers, the root systems were as strong as some of the woody stabilizers. And so I've always kind of questioned that part of the PFC process. So I think that is a good question. It's one of those things in PFC that, you know, it's kind of cookbooky, and it comes across that, yeah, it's pretty easy. We can say these streams need them and these streams don't. At the same time, there's, you know, folks with 30 or 40 years of experience in Nevada specifically, who are some of those that say, yeah, we need woodies in these streams. So I just wanted to, I was thinking about that. I wanted to add that.
Brad, do you have anything you would like to add from our previous presentation?
No, I can't think of anything.
Okay, then. Do we have any announcements we need to make, Lindsay? Okay. There will be a follow-up evaluation coming to each of you by email, and we would appreciate anything that you could do to please fill that out. I do have a couple of questions that are bouncing forward here. First question, will the presentations provided over the past 2 days be posted for further review? I do know that they are being recorded, and yes, they will be up for further review. They will be posted on Extension website or UNR's website, or all of the above. I think I've got one or two more questions here. Just comments and kudos, okay. Well, okay, given that, I want to thank all of you for participating as much as you have participated in this edition, this first virtual edition of Cattlemen's Update for Nevada. And so next year, I think it'll be a sort of a hybrid system where we have some in-person stuff and some virtual stuff. We'll see what the COVID brings. So surely we can't be shut down for another year. So hopefully next year we'll be out and about, and we'll have some kind of a hybrid version for this. So without further ado, we appreciate it. We'll let you go feed your critters. Adios.